Friday the 13th, Church of the Divine Psychopath, Chapter 15. "Get those girls out of here! We'll buy you some time," Noon hollered. Operator Marsh stood beside her, cocking his shotgun and drawing a bead on Jason. "Just fucking run!" Hobbs shouted as he ducked past Noon. She said something in response, but it was lost under the thunder as she opened up with her own FN MK-46, and Marr cut loose with his shotgun. Jason's body was battered by the force of the attack, twitching and dancing as bullets tore into him. He struggled to move towards the operators, but the sheer firepower held him back, as if he were trying to walk into a hurricane. Blood exploded from Jason's convulsing body. Samantha Noon advanced, snarling, putting round after round into the lunatic's chest. Flame from the muzzle of her gun lit up the night. She was aiming for Jason's heart, the torrent of bullets opening up a gory, shredded mess where the thing ought to be. Bits of stringy meat were flung from Jason's torso, his shirt tearing away to tattered strips. But he wouldn't fall. Noon snapped off her words one at a time, through clenched teeth as she continued to pour gunfire into Jason's chest. "I would like you to die!" Jason Voorhees, however, was not cooperating. Operator Marr stepped past her on the left, his shotgun firing a ribbon of flame. Noon watched the weapon rip holes in Jason's torso, shoving him back a few more feet. Then the killer was coming at them again, despite the rain of lead impacting his body. Marr moved a couple steps closer as he fired another round, hoping to put a bigger hole in the target. Then Noon's gun clicked. She couldn't believe it. She had emptied the belt into him. 200 rounds. His chest had to be like meat pudding by then, and he was still coming at them, staring with those yellow dead eyes. Mars's shotgun lit up the scene again, the buckshot tearing through Jason's right knee, blowing bits of bone and cartilage away. Finally, Voorhees wobbled a little. Marr took another step towards the blood-spattered murderer, preparing to take out the other knee. "Not too close, Marr," Noon warned, with practiced ease. She slid an ammo cassette from her pocket and jammed it into the machine gun, keeping her eyes on Jason the entire time, which is why she saw the machete flash towards Marr's throat and the streak of blood that trailed behind the blade. Choking, the man staggered backwards, putting himself directly between Noon and Jason. He spun to stare with wild eyes at Noon, blood burbling from the deep slash at the base of his neck. "Holy shit!" Noon said, before the tip of the machete erupted from Mars's Kevlar vest directly in the center of his chest. A spout of blood hosed across Noon's face, effectively obliterating her view through the night vision goggles. Mar's last act before his life sputtered away was to squeeze the trigger one more time. The big shotgun coughed up a fireball. It could have been worse. The blast only took off 2 of the toes on Noon's right foot. Screaming in pain, she collapsed to that side, instinctively pulling the trigger of her own weapon. If Marr hadn't already been quite dead, he could have been considered lucky. The half-dozen 5.56 caliber rounds Noon had fired whizzed past his falling body, thudding into the trees beyond. As Mars's corpse fell across Noon, the dead weight drove her machine gun back into her face, striking her mouth. Tasting blood and unable to see through her goggles, the woman frantically wriggled backwards, trying to go where she knew Jason wasn't. Slithering out from under her fallen comrade, Noon reached up to tear her night vision goggles off. Jason Voorhees looked down, his machete arching directly towards her face. Grunting, Noon dodged to the side. The machete cut into the ground an inch away from her head, showering her face with dirt. Still got the gun, she thought. She lifted the nose of the machine gun towards Jason as he withdrew the machete, preparing for another strike. As she pulled the trigger, Jason's left hand closed over the barrel. 3 or 4 slugs hit him in the chest before he yanked the gun from her grip and hurled it away. The superheated barrel seared the dead flesh of Jason's hand, filling the air with a noxious stench. Shrieking uncharacteristically, Noon rolled away a microsecond before the machete blade came down again. Twisting, she fired a staggering kick into the side of Jason's head, snapping it aside. The brutish madman turned back slowly to glower at her. The kick had knocked his mask slightly askew, and only one of the yellow eyes peered out at her. Noon found that somehow satisfying, as if she'd injured him. As Jason reached up to straighten his mask, Noon scuttled to her left and pushed herself up on her feet, favoring her wounded leg. She risked a quick look around for her gun, but it was nowhere to be seen. Didn't matter. She'd tear his guts out with her bare hands if she had to. Then Jason, his mask properly aligned once again, was coming at her. Thanks to the heavy gunfire that Noon and Mar had unleashed, the entire front of Jason's torso looked like it had been smeared with pepperoni pizza. Blood everywhere. Torn flesh danced around as the killer stomped towards her, his decayed hands outstretched. Noon leapt, rocketing a spinning kick with her gunshot foot into her attacker. The blow impacted Jason's right shoulder, barely jarring him. Noon howled with pain as she came back down, putting even more hurt on her shredded foot. With incredible speed, Jason responded with a backhanded left that smashed her nose and sent a fountain of blood gushing into the dirt. Noon staggered backwards, somehow managing to stay on her feet. She bends at the waist, badly rattled. Somebody was flipping the lights on and off in her skull. Blood streamed down her face. Her foot felt like she had run it down in a garbage disposal and then dipped it in lye, and then put it back in the garbage disposal for another round. Agonizingly, she lifted her head to see Jason reaching for her. "No!" Her words were silenced as his thick fingers closed on her throat. She felt her trachea collapsing under the crushing grip. As Jason lifted her off the ground, Samantha Noon tore at him with both hands, clawing chunks of meat from his demolished torso and flinging them in every direction. The masked maniac stared at his flailing victim, seemingly unaware that pieces of him were being ripped away and hurled into the bushes. He raised his machete. Noon's eyes widened as she stared at the blade that was poised to strike, but she continued to rip furiously at Jason Voorhees. A shred of his own flesh was slung across the blade of the machete. The killer looked at the dripping piece of meat, then casually flicked it from the blade. Then he plunged the machete into Noon's guts, sawing the blade in and out, excruciatingly working it upwards. Noon gave up trying to tear Jason apart and focused instead on holding her intestines in place. She felt the machete scrape upwards against her breastbone. Then whoever was working that light switch in her head turned it off for good. Maybe Rickles was right. Maybe I should just leave. Upstairs in the main cabin at Camp Crystal Lake, Don James continued to linger outside Father Long's bedroom. The sound of the father's spiritual guidance of the three widowed women had ceased a short time before, but Don still hadn't worked up the nerve to knock on the door, largely because his concerns over recent developments at the ministry had slowly mutated into simple anger. Especially once he'd heard the sounds emanating from Father Long's room. Now he could hear gunfire off in the distance. None of it was right. Don quietly sucked in a deep breath, fighting his emotions. Just like every other member of the congregation, he had a story of his own about Father Long and how Father Long had pulled him up by his bootstraps, lifted him from the cesspool of sin he'd been wallowing in. And he felt terrible about the anger that was rising within him. All of it was wrong. Folding his muscular arms across his chest, Don gazed at the assortment of ugly tattoos marring his flesh. He'd acquired most of them during his stay in prison, when he did a stretch for possession and intent to distribute. What a joke, he thought. Dealing meth was his career, and he had had some pretty grand plans where that career was concerned. He wasn't going to be some penny-ante street hustler working out of a crack motel in a poor neighborhood. He was going to create a network of distributors, not dealers. That was thinking too small. He needed distributors, and branch out his operation into a multi-state network. There were dreams of a beachfront property down Mexico way, and long drives on empty highways, straddling his bike with the wind in his face and money in his wallet. Lots and lots of money. Don't get him started on the girls. Then his biggest client dropped dime on him. He was lucky, really. He only wound up doing 5 years, but it wrecked all of his plans, left him destitute and struggling to get along in the real world. He was working at a laundromat for $6 an hour, making change for obnoxious college students and cleaning lint out of the dryer traps when he actually met Father Long. The good father had come into the laundromat late one night, asking if he could post a flyer for his little strip mall church on the bulletin board. Don had never been one to buy into any kind of religious mumbo-jumbo, but his mother was pretty hardcore about God and heaven and all that. Before she got shot in the stomach by a carjacker in a Walmart parking lot and died crying while people pushed loaded shopping carts past her. Don hadn't had anything else to do that night, though, so he and the father had talked. By the end of his shift, Don was on his knees begging Jesus to come into his life. He'd gotten a little more than he bargained for with Father Long and the ministry of the Heavenly Vessel, however. The father's beliefs about Jason Voorhees weren't openly discussed with new members of the congregation. Long always introduced people into the true nature of the church slowly. It was something of a radical belief system, to put it mildly, and Long liked to be sure people were surfing on his wave before he sprung all the details on them. Admittedly, Don had been a little put off by it at first, but the more Father Long explained to him his theory about Jason Voorhees being the hand of God, the more sense it made, and he sure as hell wouldn't have minded turning Jason loose on the punk who had put a slug in his mother's belly, leaving her to die on the cold pavement. There was a sinner who needed judging. That's for certain. It had all sounded good in theory, but deep inside, Don never really believed any of it would come to pass. For one thing, how the hell did Father Long ever expect to bring Jason Voorhees back, or even find him in the first place? To him, it was like waiting around for Jesus Christ to return. Something to build some spiritual faith around, maybe, but it was unlikely he'd ever see the day. And truthfully, Don hadn't been sure he even wanted to see that day. Life as a member of the ministry had been good. He wasn't getting rich, while Father Long paid him a small stipend for all the work he did for the church. Don still needed his job at the laundromat in order to make ends meet, but he was happy, and that was something he wasn't quite sure he'd known since he was a little kid. And somehow, being involved with the church and making new friends amongst the congregation made it easier to choke down that laundromat job. Some of the college kids still rubbed him the wrong way, of course, and it wasn't like he was sipping margaritas on the veranda while gazing out at the ocean, but he could still pop the top on a cold Corona, sit on the sidewalk outside the laundromat, and watch the traffic go by. And when it came right down to it, that had some honest appeal all its own. Give him that and some Motley Crue on the CD player, and he figured he could live out the rest of his life just fine, without ever seeing the hand of God clench his judgmental fingers. Then Curtis Rickles and Father Long had found the body, and things started getting truly weird. Don hadn't been very comfortable with any of it since then, but for some reason he hadn't spoken up about any of his misgivings. For one thing, the rest of the congregation seemed so excited about the day of reckoning being upon the world, and Don didn't want to seem like the odd man out after everything Father Long and the ministry had done for him. Then they'd brought Jason Voorhees kicking and screaming back to life, and people started dying. Good people. People who didn't deserve to go out like they had. And now here he was, standing around loitering. That's what Rickles had called it, and the word certainly fits, outside the father's bedroom, waiting for him to finish soothing the souls of his new wives, hoping he could finally talk some sense into the man, or, if he had to solve the problems in another way, whatever it took to make things right. His mind returned to Father Long, who was in there fucking the wives of 3 decent men who had given up their lives. 3 men who had died because they put their faith in Father Long. No matter what you believed about God or the devil or Jason Voorhees, the kind of behavior Long was displaying in return for that faith was just plain wrong. And it made Don James very angry. The whole scenario was worsening with every passing hour, and it was time he did something about it. For God's sake, he had gone along with Father Long and Rickles when they wanted to ambush those soldiers. He had shot other men, probably killed at least one of them, maybe more. And while he might have been dragging along a somewhat checkered past, being a killer had never entered into the equation. Father Long had taught him to love the Lord, and he figured that whole list of his commandments came along with the package. Thou shalt not kill, as the big man upstairs put it so eloquently. But Father Long seemed to be taking over as the big man upstairs, making his own list of commandments. Thou shalt go ahead and kill if I say it's okay, and bring unto me thy widowed wives, so that I might enjoy the pleasures of their flesh, being chief among those commandments. And he thought, let's not forget the classic, thou shalt feel free to get on with a 17-year-old girl if it tickles thy fancy. Don's lip curled in a sneer of distaste. Curtis Rickles' dogged pursuit of Meredith, host, was sickening, and he couldn't understand how Father Long could not only stand by and allow it to happen, but seemingly condone it as well. Don brought a hand up to rub his brow. His head was aching terribly. He should have spoken up earlier when Meredith was trying to talk sense to the congregation after Jason was revived. She seemed to be the only one in the group who had her damn head screwed on straight. Just a kid, a teenager, but she saw through Father Long's. Don hesitated at the thought. Just call it what it is, madness. The girl had seen through Father Long's madness and tried to do something about it, tried to save the others from falling victim to it. And Don had stood by in silence, allowing them to shout her down, make her look foolish, not to mention allowing Curtis Rickles to put his hands all over the poor kid. And now she was gone, run off into the night. She might even be dead if her luck was bad and she ran into Jason out there. Dawn hoped like hell she had made it out, that she had tracked down the soldiers and found some help there. But more than anything, he hoped Curtis Rickles wouldn't track her down. Dawn figured if he was going to kill another man, there couldn't be a better choice of victim than Curtis Rickles. He had tried to give the guy the benefit of the doubt at first, what with him being an ex-Marine and all. But it became more and more difficult for him to cut the guy any slack. Then he remembered that Timothy McVeigh had served his country too, before slaughtering hundreds of innocent people in Oklahoma City. No, the hard and simple truth was that Rickles was nothing but a scumbag and a predator. And Dawn was starting to believe the same thing about Father Long. It was time to voice his concerns. Stop letting all the horrible shit happen without trying to do something about it. Don James stared at the bare wooden door separating him from Father Long. His headache pounded, sending spikes of pain through his skull. Steeling himself, he pushed himself away from the wall and stepped up to the door. He didn't like the idea of interrupting what was going on in there, didn't want to see it, but something had to be done, and nobody else in the congregation seemed inclined to do it. Don raised his hand, curling it into a tight fist. It was time to end the madness. Or at least give it his best shot. No one else should die because of Long's insane beliefs. If it came down to it, he thought he could even bring himself to kill the father. Maybe. Doing so would probably get him killed, but at least it might save lives in the long run. All Don had to do was knock on the door. He stared at his clenched fist, the knuckles whitening, his arm trembling. He stared at the tattoos scattered across his flesh. Father Long had once offered to pay for their removal if Don wanted them gone. He chose to keep them as a reminder of what his life had been, what the ministry had saved him from. Just knock on the door. End this now. Gasping, Don suddenly lowered his arm to his side. The painful throbbing in his temples matched the rapid beating of his heart. The gunfire outside had died away. His nose mere inches away from Father Long's door, Don stared at its wooden surface for several moments. Then he turned and walked away. Chapter 16. Behind the wooden door that Don James had walked away from, content in his sparse room, Father Long lay with his head back against Patricia Crinkle's sweaty belly and listened intently to the night. Hoping to hear more gunfire, the sounds seemed to come from far away. Probably the soldiers, he thought, the unbelievers, encountering the hand of God. Long smiled at the thought of the sinners meeting their rightful fate. Beside Patricia, lying on her stomach, Christine Shearing stared up at Father Long with a blank expression. She looked shell-shocked, lost inside herself. Not unexpected, considering what she had been through, what they'd all been through. The temperature in the room was stifling, as if the entire day's heat had collected there. The strenuous physical activity that had taken place only added to the uncomfortable warmth, and now the smell of sweat and sex hung in the thick air like fog. Father Long's eyes flicked toward Susanna Bookwalter, who stood at the window gazing out into the night. All of them were nude, including Long. He had done his best to soothe the pain of their losses the only way he knew how, but it was obvious that he had more work to do in that respect. None of the three seemed to take much comfort in his ministrations, although Christine and Susanna had wept. Surely a sign of release, he thought. Do you think they're fighting again? Susanna asked nervously, the words clinging to her throat as if determined to stay buried in her chest. It's too far away, I think, Long said, stroking Patricia's thigh. Besides, if the soldiers were back, someone would have come for me, for us, so you three could be taken to a safer place in the camp. Susanna turned towards him. What do you think it is, then? Long smiled languorously at her. Perhaps our enemies have met with judgment. He patted the bed. Now come lie down with us. Hesitantly, Susanna walked to the bed and stretched out on her belly alongside Christine. Roll over so I can see the Lord's work in you, Long said, gesturing. With a glance at Patricia, Susanna did as Father Long asked, shifting in the bed and rolling onto her back. Her large breasts sagged towards her armpits, and she cupped them in her hands, as if trying to keep them from escaping. At 44, Susanna was the oldest of the three women, but carried her age well, aside from her deep lack of self-confidence and a few shiny stretch marks. In the quiet of the evening, Father Long listened to the soft breathing of his female companions, his wives. After a few moments, a distant muffled scream drifted to the cabin. Judgment, Long said, smiling in satisfaction. Patricia Crinkle began to cry, very softly. Why doesn't Christine have to lie on her back? Susanna asked, staring blankly up at the ceiling. She still struggled to contain her sweaty breast in her relatively tiny hands. Roll over, Christine, Long urged the woman. We're all family here, after all. Sighing, Christine wriggled and twisted, rolling onto her back and settling in again, her sweaty body slipping down between Susanna's and Patricia's. A thick, pinkish-white, jagged scar ran from somewhere within her pubic hair upwards across her belly, coming to a stop just below her left breast. It looked as if her appendix had been removed by a threshing machine. Susanna stared at the scar, her mouth hanging open slightly. I'm sorry. You didn't see it before? Susanna shook her head, her gaze shifting to Christine's face. I didn't want to look at everyone, she whispered. What happened? I was in a car wreck 6 years ago, Christine explained. Part of the dashboard went through me. I died on the operating table. But she was resurrected. Father Long traced the length of the horrible scar, his fingertips sliding over the snarled lumps of flesh. As his fingers delved into Christine's pubic hair, he smiled up at Susanna's stunned face. As we all shall be, to join God in his glorious kingdom. His hand dipped between Christine's legs. When Hobb caught up to Kelly and Meredith, the two were standing in the middle of the dirt road, clinging tightly to each other. What the hell are you doing standing around? He asked, coming to a stop next to them. We didn't know where to go, Kelly said, her voice trembling. That made sense. Hobb looked up and down the dark road, trying to spot the strike team. Where's everybody else? Kelly shook her head. I don't know. We haven't seen anybody. Meredith was crying again. The sight of Jason coming at her must have shaken something loose. The girl shuddered violently as huge wet sobs came from deep within her body. Feeling bad for her, Hobb almost told her everything would be okay, then thought better of it. No reason to bullshit the dame any more than she'd already been bullshitted. Noon must have sent them further down, towards the campground. We'd better catch up. What about the... Kelly searched for the words, settling for a gesture instead. She pointed back towards where they'd run into Jason. Noon, and the other one. His name was Marr. Hobb shook his head. You heard the scream same as I did. Kelly looked at the ground. They bought us a chance, Hobb said. Kelly's eyes snapped back up to connect angrily with Hobb's. Is that all the feeling you have? 2 people died for us and all you can say is they bought us a chance? Don't talk to me about how I feel, lady. Is it because she beat the hell out of you back there? Is that why you don't care? You mean I should have real feelings, Hobb snapped? Kind of like the way you ran out on your friends when Jason was cutting them down in your little church? Those kind of feelings? Kelly glanced at Meredith, ashamed. We've got to keep moving. Hobb felt bad about what he'd said, but they didn't have time for this nonsense. Otherwise, we're throwing away what Noon and Marr died for. He lifted his machine gun, displaying it for Kelly and Meredith. Out of ammo. I'm basically unarmed here, except for my sidearm. And since I just put a shitload of bullets into the so-called hand of God back there, and it didn't even slow him down, I'd say that a pistol isn't going to help us much. Hobb slung the rifle over his shoulder, then drew his sidearm, an HK-M23, and flipped the safety off. I could try to blind him by shining the laser sight in his eyes. I don't think you should make jokes, Meredith snapped, frowning at him. You're right. I shouldn't, Hobb said. With that, he put a gentle hand on Kelly's back, and the 3 began walking at a fast pace. Hobb directed them towards the tree line, where they'd have a chance to find cover if they ran into anything untoward. He was a little concerned about Meredith's bare feet, but figured stepping on a stick or a broken beer bottle was better than walking in the open, where the girl's chances of taking a bullet in the heart or a machete in the face increased dramatically. As the 3 made their way along the roadside, Noon's dying screams replayed themselves in Hobb's head. What would you have done about it? He asked himself. Throw your gun at him? You let her die for you. You let Marr die for you. He should have gone back. Kelly was right. He was an asshole. Why should he have gone back, though? So he could die, too? He was out of ammo. He had expected Noon and Marr to lay down a little surprise fire, then run into the forest. Shit, he thought. I told them to run. They didn't have to turn it into an all-or-nothing scenario. One thing was certain. He wouldn't have to make a decision about retiring, assuming he lived through this in the first place. He'd be lucky if all the agency did was kick his ass to the curb and not bury him in a deep, dark cell reserved only for the most colossal fuck-ups. Hobb scanned the trees on either side of the road, watching for any sign of movement. Every 50 feet or so, he let out a tiny clicking sound, a signal to the strike team. If any of the operators were close, they'd respond in kind. and ideally not shoot him or the women. Exhaustion washed over him. How long had it been since he'd last slept? And the other operators had been going just as hard as he had. Harder than that. Most of them had been involved in the firefight earlier. They had to be wiped out, ready to drop. He lifted his arm and pushed his sleeve back to check his watch. 4:15 a.m. It'd be light soon. They needed to get to Camp Crystal Lake while it was still dark, while they still had some sort of advantage. Suddenly, he saw Crystal Lake. There was an answer to Hobbs' signal. Meredith spun, looking excitedly at Hobb. "Did you hear that?" He put a finger to his lips, shushing the girl. "There's a reason we make little bird sounds instead of talking," he whispered. About 10 yards down the road, the helmeted head of one of the operators poked up from behind some bushes. With the night vision goggles obscuring the man's face, Hobb couldn't be sure who it was, but as they drew closer, he recognized Chapin's dented chin. There was still a little grease from the underside of the lav smeared on it. A handful of other operators stepped into view as Chapin pushed his goggles up to give Hobb a questioning look. "Where's Noon? Mar?" "We ran into Jason," Hobb said. "They didn't make it." "Son of a bitch," Chapin hissed. "We're running out of operators real fucking fast here. Have you been able to get through to Levinger and Blair or Atchison?" "Radio's been hit or miss as usual. Last word from Levinger, he was still trying to get through to HQ, call in some help. At least that's what it sounded like," he said. "Hasn't been anything since." Hobbs stared out at Crystal Lake. Fucking cesspool. The road curved away to the right just ahead, leading to the campground and the assholes who were responsible for making his life a living hell. Sighing, Hobb turned back to Chapin. "Anybody scope things out up ahead?" "Yeah." Chapin ran the edge of his thumb along the deep cleft of his chin, smearing the grease around a little more. Hobb wondered if he ever lost any food in that cavernous dent. Meredith said, smiling sheepishly. She hesitantly reached out and wiped the grease from Chapin's chin with her thumb. Chapin looked at her curiously, and she held the thumb up for him to see the black goo. Then she wiped it clean on Hobbs' t-shirts. "Oh, well," Hobb thought. "Not like it didn't have blood on it already." "Thanks," Chapin told the girl, smiling. "Finish your story," Hobb prompted the chunky operator. "Oh, yeah." Chapin returned his attention to Hobb, looking more than a little embarrassed. "We spotted a couple guys with hunting rifles patrolling the campground, but if they've got men placed anywhere else, they know how to hide 'em." Hobb glanced at Kelly. "Word on the street is they've got a jarhead calling plays." "I love that story," Chapin said. "What's the plan?" "What do we have left, men and material?" 8 operators, not including Levinger, Blair and Atchison. 3 MK-46s, 4 shotguns, 1 milker. A couple men have frags and phosphorus. Chapin was looking funny at Hobb. "Where's your vest and helmet?" "Don't ask. I'm out of ammo, by the way. Got a spare?" Chapin slipped an ammo cassette from his vest and handed it over. "You put an entire cassette into Jason?" Holstering his sidearm, Hobb nodded sharply. And he kept coming. Hobb stared at Chapin as he slipped his machine gun off his shoulder and drove the ammo cassette into place. He just kept coming. Chapin's normally reddish cheeks paled. He swallowed hard. "Sir?" Chapin said. "Yeah?" "I ask again, what's the plan?" Hobb looked past his rifle at the man. "We're going on to Camp Crystal Lake. If somebody shoots at us, we kill him." Okay. This has been Chapter 15 and 16 of Friday the 13th, Church of the Divine Psychopath. It's kind of a short video today. I think we've got one more upload left before this book is finished. I'm going to go ahead and read Chapters 17 through 21 in the next video. And after that, we'll be moving on to a Nightmare on Elm Street novel by Black Flame. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop a comment. Once we reach 100 subs, I'm going to be giving this book away based on interaction in the comment section of the videos. One of you subs will get this book, my only copy of Church of the Divine Psychopath. Alright, everybody have a great day, and I'll see you on the next upload. Be sure to click that bell so you know when the new chapters drop.